Every Tuesday morning, an elderly woman named Alain Hart walked slowly to the little bakery at the end of her quiet street. She was 78 years old and lived alone in a small blue house surrounded by climbing rows. Neighbors knew her as a gentle woman who always smiled, but very few people knew how lonely she had become. Her husband Rowan had died 12 years earlier, and since then Alain had learned how to fill her days with small routines. She watered her garden every morning. She read beside the window every afternoon, and every evening she placed one cup of tea on the table, even though she always drank it alone. Then one Tuesday something strange happened. When Alain opened her front door, she found a beautiful bunch of white roses resting on the doorstep. Here was no card, no message, only a small silver ribbon tied around the stems. Alain looked up and down the empty street. Nobody was there. She carried the flowers inside and placed them in an old glass vase that had belonged to her mother. For the first time in many years, her quiet kitchen felt different. The following Tuesday, another bouquet appeared. This time there were pale pink carnations mixed with white roses. Again, there was no message. Alain smiled to herself and wondered who could possibly know that she loved carnations. Next week there were yellow tulips, then lavender, then tiny blue flowers she had not seen since she was a young girl. Every bouquet seemed to tell her something. Somion was watching. Somion remembered Somion cared, but Alain could not imagine who. She asked her neighbor Maribel if she knew anything. Maribel laughed and said perhaps Alain finally had a secret admirer. Alain shook her head and smiled. At her age, she thought secret admirers belonged to another life, but that night she found something unusual beneath the vase. A small folded piece of paper. There were only 7 words written on it: I have remembered you all these years. Helen stared at the message for a long time. Her hands began to tremble. Best those words reminded her of someone she had not seen for more than 50 years. Simeon, she had believed, had forgotten her completely, and for the first time she wondered if the flowers were not a new beginning but a message from her past. Alain barely slept that night. She kept thinking about the 7 words written on the paper. I have remembered you all these years. There was only one person who could have written something like that. This name was Kalen Moore. When Alain was 20. Kalen had worked at the old railway station near her village. He was quiet and thoughtful and always carried a small notebook in his coat pocket. He had fallen in love slowly, without ever saying the words aloud. Every morning he would wait near the station entrance just to see her walk past. Sometimes he gave her wild flower summits. They shared tea beside the river. They had planned to leave the village together one summer, but life changed everything. Alain's father became seriously ill, and she decided she could not leave her family. Keelan had received a job offer in another city and believed Alain no longer wanted him. Neither of them explained their feelings. Neither of them fought for their future. One morning Keelan left, and Alain never saw him again. She married Rowan several years later and built a good life. She had loved her husband deeply. A small part of her heart had always wondered what had happened to Keelan. Next Tuesday another bouquet arrived. At this time there was a photograph beneath the flowers. It showed the old railway station as it had looked decades ago. In the back was another message: some places never forget the people who once stood there. Alain sat down slowly. She felt tears gathering in her eyes. Wanted to believe it was Kalen, but she was afraid to hope. That afternoon she visited the old railway station. The building had been closed for years. Windows were dusty and the platform was covered with weeds. Sullivan stood near the place where Kalen had once waited for her. Then she noticed something carved into the wooden bench. Initials, and her heart began beating faster. She touched the letters with trembling fingers. Amin had kept that memory alive, but when she turned to leave, she saw a man standing across the road who was elderly, wore a dark coat, and held a walking stick. He looked directly at her for several seconds, neither moved. Then the man slowly removed his hat. Aloud could not breathe. She knew that face even after all those years. It was Kalen. Kalen looked older than the man she remembered. His hair was completely silver. His face was lined with years, but his eyes were exactly the same gentle eyes that had once made her feel soft. And neither of them spoke at first. Then Kalen smiled. Alain began to cry, crossed the road slowly and stopped a few steps away from Harry. Was afraid you would not remember me. Lowen shook her head. He remembered you every year. Kaelin looked down. Then he told her the truth had not returned because he wanted to change her life. He had returned because he had recently learned that Alaun was still living in the village. For years he had wondered if she had been happy, had searched for her many times, but never wanted to disturb her family. Then one day he found an old photograph of them together, decided that before it was too late he wanted to give her one final gift. Flowers were not meant to make her fall in love again. They were meant to remind her that the girl she had once been had never been forgotten. Alone wiped her tears. Told Kaelin about Rowan. Told him about their marriage and the years they had shared. Told him that Rowan had been kind and that she had loved him until his final breath. Kaelin smiled sadly. Then he said something Alaun never expected. I am glad you were loved. Those words broke something inside her because she realized that Kaelin had never been angry, had never blamed her, had simply carried an old memory with him before they separated that afternoon. Kaelin gave her one final envelope and opened it. After returning home, inside was an old letter written more than 50 years earlier. Kaelin had written it on the morning he left, had never sent Iton the letter. He had told her that he loved her, had told her that if life ever brought them together again, he hoped she would know that leaving had never meant forgetting. Kaelin held the letter against her heart. For the first time she understood that some people leave our lives without leaving our memories. But the story did not end there. The following morning Alaun received another bouquet. This time the flowers were different. There was no mystery left. Only a new message: may I visit you tomorrow? The next afternoon Kaelin arrived at Alaun's house carrying 2 cups of tea. He looked nervous and laughed softly because she had never seen him nervous before. They sat in the garden beneath the old apple tree for hours. They talked about everything they had missed. Kaelin told her about his years away. He had worked as a teacher, had traveled to distant places, had married once, but his wife had passed away many years earlier. Alaun told him about Rowan, showed him photographs of her family, told him about the children she had taught when she was younger. She told him about the quiet years after Rowan died. Kaelin listened carefully. Then he asked her one question: were you lonely? Alaun looked at the flowers beside them. Sometimes, she answered. Kaelin nodded. Then he said something she would never forget: you should not have to be lonely. No. From that day Kaelin began visiting every afternoon. They walked slowly through the village. They drank tea. They laughed about their youth. They visited the old railway station. Sometimes they sat silently in the garden. Thing about their friendship felt like the love story they once imagined. It was something gentler, something built from memories and forgiveness. But one morning Kaelin did not arrive. Alaun waited all afternoon. Then she waited the next day, and the third day a young woman knocked on her door. She introduced herself as Sienna Moresh, was Céline's granddaughter. Alaun's heart sank. Sienna held a small wooden box. Told Alaun that Kaelin had become very ill. Before going to hospital, he had asked Sienna to deliver the box. Inside was a collection of old things: railway photograph, a pressed flower, an old train ticket, and dozens of letters. Céline opened the first letter. It was written shortly after Kaelin had left the villa. The second was written 10 years later, third 20 years later. There were letters for almost every decade of his life. He had never sent them, but he had written them anyway. At the bottom of the box was one final note: spent a lifetime believing I had missed my chance, and I discovered that sometimes life does not return the past. It simply gives us one more morning to say what should have been said. Alaun pressed the note to her chest, and she asked Sienna one question: will you take me to him? Sienna smiled through her tears. Kaelin had been waiting for her. Alaun arrived at the hospital just before sunset. Kaelin was resting beside the window, looked weak, but when he saw her he smiled. You Camilo, and took his hand off. Of course I can. For a while they said nothing. There was no need. All the words they had carried for more than 50 years were already between them. Alaun told him that she had kept his letters, told him that she was grateful for every flower, every visit, every memorial. Kaelin smiled. Then he asked her if she remembered the first flowers he had ever given. Haralaun laughed softly. Wilfors beside the railway station closed his eyes, and Smiletti was afraid you had forgotten. He never forgot. The following morning Kalen passed away peacefully. Eluan stayed beside him until the end. She cried for the young man she had loved. She cried for the old friend she had found again, but most of all she cried because life had given them something rare, a chance to say goodbye properly. Weeks passed and months. Alawan returned to her quiet blue house, but it no longer felt as lonely as before. Every Tuesday morning flowers appeared on her doorstep. Were always different amidst roses, sometimes carnation, amidst wild flowers. First few times Alawan thought Sienna had sent them. Then one morning she found a small envelope beneath the ribbon. Inside was a note from Sina. Grandfather asked me to continue the flowers. If he could know, said you deserve to wake up knowing that someone remembered. Yoloan smiled through her tears. From that day she began leaving flowers outside her own neighbor's door. She left them for widows, for lonely people, for anyone who might need a reminder that they mattered. Years later the whole street had become known for its flowers, and every Tuesday the blue house filled with color. Loan never found another secret admirer. She no longer needed one because she had finally understood what Kalen had wanted her to know. Love is not always about having someone beside you forever. Semites love is simply knowing that somewhere in this world someone remembered your smile. Samin remembered your kindness. Someone remembered the person you were, and even after they are gone that love can still bloom just like the flowers on Alawan's doorstep.